Hey everybody, I wanted to show off the performance comparing the Surface Book 15 to the 13.5-inch version, and also show a little bit of an issue that I'm seeing with these devices, and that is the graphics seem to be a little bit throttled, unfortunately. The 15-inch actually, even if it has a 6,000 megahertz on the RAM, once it exceeds a certain power limit, it drops that memory speed down to 5,000 megahertz, I've noticed. And performance, while it can peak at about 120 watts, over time it seems to go down to using about 90 to 95 watts, which is unfortunate because you're giving up quite a bit of performance as things heat up. And it seems like there's actually quite a bit of a fan speed that could be ramped up, but in the interest of quietness, it seems like they're really tuning this to be friendly in terms of heat, that you don't notice the fans. Right, they're very quiet. I mean, that is a plus, and your burst rate on the GPU is good, but sustained performance does suffer. And so I wanted to show that off. First off, I'm going to run these at the same time in the same ambient temperature. It's about 74 degrees ambient temperature in my office here. And we're running Shadow of the Tomb Raider at high settings on both of these. And we're going to run that benchmark and see how they compare. So there's two dynamic factors with these devices, and that is that the top CPU portion has a fan in the 15-inch and the 13-inch does not. So that is a difference, and then a 1650 graphics versus 1660 Ti. But we'll see how well that works out for each of these devices in a second here. So I'm just loaded these up. I'm going to hit R at the same time to start the benchmark. And let's go ahead and see which of these loads quicker. You can also see the difference in the tones of the screen. They're pretty close. They're both seem to be tuned quite nicely. The colors are great. Look at that. The 13.5-inch started first. Okay. So that 1660 Ti is doing pretty well. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to let these benchmarks run, show you the end, and then I'm immediately going to run them again. You'll see how much the performance suffers versus the first run. Then I'll run them again, and we'll just keep doing that until we see what happens, what kind of frame rates we could actually expect as a sustained performance. So let's take you to the end of this very first benchmark. Okay, so the 13-inch averaged 41 frames per second, and the 15-inch 66 frames per second. But let's go ahead and run the benchmark again and see how much our performance degrades. Okay, so on the second run, 40 frames versus 62. I'm going to run it again. Okay, so I noticed I have a temperature gauge back here, power draw gauge back here. And if I've let these sit here for about half an hour, just getting completely heat soaked, because when you're sitting in the Tomb Raider menu, there's lots of graphics in the background that actually use a ton of power. So they both are heat soaked. They're both got fans that are going pretty loud, and they're both warmed up quite nicely. But anyways, the 15-inch, it has 115 to 120 watts headroom on its AC adapter, but yet it goes all the way down to 78 watts. So let's do our full heat-soaked run and see what that looks like. What we've seen on each run is that the difference between these two devices becomes less and less as they're more heat soaked. So yeah, look, the 15-inch is only running at 55, and this is going almost 40. So we'll see what it ends up being at the end of the benchmark run, but the 15-inch does lose a lot of performance over time from heat soak. All right, so the final heat soaked run, average frames per second 54 on the 15-inch and 38 on the 13-inch. So if we do a little analysis of what we're looking at, on our first run, the 15-inch got 66 frames per second versus the 13.5 getting 41. 15-inch was 60% better. On the second run, we lost a little ground. 15-inch 62 to 40 was only 55% better. Same here, about 55%. In the heat-soaked run, we got 54 frames per second versus 38 frames per second, which meant the 15-inch was only 42% better when it was fully heat-soaked. So the 15-inch loses about 20% of its, it performs about 80% of its first run performance over time, where the 13.5 inch is a little more consistent. It got 92% of its original first run performance. One caveat I've noticed is if you get this thing any hotter, sometimes the CPU drops to like 1 gigahertz. It seems to, when it doesn't have the fan, I have seen where it just, basically goes down to 1 gigahertz and it isn't doing a whole lot of anything. This benchmark was not enough to kind of trigger that state, but that is a potential if the room was any warmer. So as one final run here, I'm just going to go grab a giant fan, point at these things, cool them all off, and see how well they do, leaving them, running full blast, see if that extra airflow actually gets stuff off of it, and if we can recover that performance just for fun, and to see what it's capable of with a fan on it. So let's go ahead and I'll do that. Okay, so I'm going to turn on this fan while they're still heat soaked and rerun the benchmark. This is just to see, assuming you were running this thing full blast and you have, this simulates the best ventilation possible to see how much performance you could actually gain while still being heat soaked. So it's just to see what happens, basically. Okay, so with the fan back on, the Surface Book 13.5 inch recovered pretty much all of its performance. It went back up to 41, which it was the same that it did in the first run. With the fan on, there must still be some, I don't think it's heat, but I think there must be some sort of power limit throttling still going on. So even with the fan on, we recovered about 60 frames per second on average, but didn't get back up to the previous glory of 66 frames per second that we got on the first run. So anyways, that's kind of what you can expect what your performance to do based on your thermals and over time. It seems like there's a combination of both temperature sensing that can limit power, but also power limit, because we saw that even removing the thermal constraint, because they had been running so long using that power, it seemed like it was just locked at a lower power mode. I have seen definitely the 15-inch drop its memory speed from 6,000 megahertz to 5,000 megahertz by itself. It just does that whenever it feels like it. So interesting results here. 13.5 inch is a little more consistent in its performance unless the CPU just completely falls flat on its face due to no airflow. But in general, the graphical performance doesn't vary as much as the 15-inch, but the 15-inch does have quite a bit more performance to offer on the table there. So anyways, if you like this, subscribe and like. If you didn't like it, oh well. You don't have to watch it. We'll see you later.